Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Q-Man channel. If you enjoy what we're doing here, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. Today, we're going to be discussing the 1985 film Rambo, First Blood Part 2. The screen flickers to life, and we find John Rambo, the barely contained storm of a man forged in the crucible of Vietnam, now existing in the quiet desperation of a forgotten existence. He's hauling logs in some remote, sun-drenched corner of the United States, a stark contrast to the jungles that defined his youth. His existence is less a life and more a slow, internal exile. It's the kind of peace that only the truly broken can appreciate, a fragile silence that screams of what was lost in Southeast Asia. Into this quiet desperation steps Colonel Sam Trotman, the man who understood Rambo better than anyone, perhaps even better than Rambo understood himself. Trotman, ever the weathered military professional, offers Rambo a chance at redemption, or at least a chance to finally close a chapter that has haunted 2 decades of American memory. The mission is simple on paper: parachute into Vietnam, confirm the presence of American POWs still held captive in secret camps, and extract them. For Rambo, this isn't just duty. It's a personal quest for ghosts he needs to lay to rest, perhaps to quiet the demons that cling to him like swamp mist. Rambo accepts, a decision that pulls him back into the theatre of war, the only place where his particular set of skills, the lethal grace of a cornered animal, makes him feel whole. He undergoes the required briefing, a sterile affair that utterly fails to capture the horror awaiting him. He's given minimal gear, a clear indication that if things go south, the brass back home has already drawn the line of plausible deniability. The insertion is rough. The parachute jump is jarring, and Rambo lands deep in the steamy, oppressive jungle. Almost immediately, the environment turns against him. The local military forces, under the command of the ruthless Lieutenant Colonel Podolsky, are not just guarding prisoners. They are actively hostile, treating the expected American rescue team as an invasion force. Rambo makes contact with an asset on the ground, a Vietnamese operative named Co Bao, whose quiet competence and deep-seated distrust of the military machine immediately resonate with Rambo's own cynical worldview. She becomes his anchor, his only real ally in a landscape riddled with betrayal. The mission quickly devolves. During a tense extraction attempt, Rambo spots a cage full of emaciated American soldiers. Before he can secure them, he is ambushed. The local troops move with ruthless efficiency. Rambo manages to fight his way out, but the captured prisoners are whisked away, and his communication equipment is destroyed. He is stranded, officially disavowed, and now fighting a war on 2 fronts: against the enemy forces and against the very mission command that sent him there. Co Bao proves invaluable. She navigates the hidden villages and enemy patrols, her knowledge of the land an extension of Rambo's own combat instincts. Their relationship blossoms in the shadow of imminent death, a brief, poignant connection between 2 survivors recognizing the same deep wounds in the other. However, this fragile alliance is shattered when Co Bao is tragically killed during a harrowing chase scene, leaving Rambo utterly alone and fueled by a rage that transcends mere duty. The discovery of the POWs, the physical proof that their sacrifice was not in vain, ignites a cold, focused fury in Rambo. He is no longer seeking rescue. He is seeking vengeance for the betrayal he feels from his own government and retribution for the life taken from him. He begins a calculated campaign of asymmetrical warfare. The jungle transforms into his personal killing ground. He utilizes his mastery of traps, explosives, and sheer brute force, systematically dismantling the enemy camps. It's a ballet of destruction, each downed soldier a tribute to the men he couldn't save before. The climax arrives when Rambo succeeds in freeing the remaining prisoners, leading them toward a rendezvous point. But Podolsky and his forces are relentless. Trotman, now horrified by the extent of the cover-up and Rambo's isolation, makes a desperate move, hijacking a helicopter to personally intervene, a final act of loyalty overriding his career responsibilities. Rambo, with the POWs secured, faces the final onslaught. In a sequence of sheer, visceral violence, he turns the tables entirely, using captured weaponry and his own guerrilla expertise to decimate the remaining enemy unit. The final confrontation with Podolsky is brutal and personal, Rambo dispensing justice with the same cold finality he once reserved for the battlefield. As the dust settles and the surviving Americans are finally airlifted out, Rambo stands amidst the wreckage. He has won the battle, secured the truth, but the victory is heavy. Troutman approaches him, offering the weary acknowledgement of a man who has seen too much, understanding that Rambo cannot simply return to hauling logs. The film closes not on triumph, but on a shared, silent understanding between two soldiers who know that for men like them, the war never truly ends. It just changes theaters. Rambo is offered a chance to walk away, finally, but the exhaustion in his eyes suggests that the only true peace lies in the fight itself. The quiet desperation that clung to Rambo in that logging camp wasn't just the absence of conflict, it was the corrosive effect of being a weapon without a war, a highly specialized instrument left rusting in the shed. He moved with a coiled lethargy, every deliberate action hinting at the explosive power held barely in check. When Troutman materialized, that granite-faced career military man whose own service record was etched with the compromises of command, it wasn't an invitation, but a recognition. Troutman saw Rambo not as a troubled veteran, but as the ultimate asset, a ghost returning to haunt the landscape where he was left for dead. The briefing confirmed Rambo's deepest fears. The Pentagon wanted confirmation, not rescue. The minimal supply drop, the insistence on radio silence should things go sour, it all screamed of official denial. It was a classic military maneuver, setting up a fall guy. But for Rambo, the mention of living American soldiers still suffering in the jungle was a direct affront to the very soul he fought to keep intact. He didn't go back for Uncle Sam. He went back for the men he believed were still breathing, the forgotten brothers in arms. The insertion was a brutal baptism. The Vietnamese jungle, hot, suffocating, and utterly unforgiving, immediately rejected the intruder. It was a sensory overload that, paradoxically, centered Rambo. Here, his training, honed in the brutal efficiency of Special Forces operations, made immediate, deadly sense. He moved like liquid shadow, his bow and massive arrows silent assassins in the dense canopy. Kobau was the unexpected grace note in the symphony of violence. She was street smart, resilient, possessing a deep, ingrained skepticism that mirrored Rambo's own wartime disillusionment. She wasn't seduced by military bravado, she understood survival on the lowest, most pragmatic level. Their connection was forged in the absolute necessity of mutual defense. A fleeting moment where Rambo could actually trust a set of eyes that weren't looking at him with pity or fear. Her death was not just a tactical setback, it was the tearing away of the one thread connecting him to something resembling humanity on that hostile soil. It was the moment John Rambo ceased being a rescue operative and became an executioner. The discovery of the starving prisoners, skeletal shell-shocked remnants of a past life, transformed Rambo's rage into something cold and absolute. His prior missions, even against the odds, had always held a sliver of hope for extraction. This time, the hope was murdered by the enemy and government indifference alike. He didn't just fight, he orchestrated a systematic dismantling of the enemy infrastructure. Watching him move through the camps, utilizing every discarded piece of gear, every natural feature of the terrain, was to witness the apex predator returning to its natural hunting grounds. He was channeling the unresolved trauma of the entire Vietnam War into targeted, surgical acts of destruction against those holding his countrymen. When Troutman arrived in the stolen chopper, it wasn't a planned extraction. It was a desperate act of insubordination, born from watching his last creation spiral into necessary vengeance. The final confrontation was less a battle and more Rambo asserting dominance over the very concept of the war that had tried to erase him. He wasn't just saving the POWs, he was reclaiming his own agency, proving that the machine could not dictate his terms of engagement or surrender. The look exchanged between him and Troutman at the end was laden with the knowledge that the war had been won. But the soldier inside Rambo was permanently scarred by the victory. He had saved the lost, but in doing so, he had confirmed that the only place he truly belonged was outside the lines of civilized society, forever bound to the shadows of conflict. Rambo's existence prior to the mission had been a carefully curated performance of normalcy, a man trying to fit the square peg of a super soldier into the round hole of civilian life. His hands, capable of snapping a man's neck with minimal effort, were now clumsily managing tongs for sawing logs, a deliberate self-mutilation of his own abilities. When Troutman appeared, the colonel carried the weight of institutional memory, the man who knew exactly how much damage a government could inflict on its best soldiers, and how to use that damage as leverage. Troutman's proposal wasn't a generous offer. It was a calculated deployment of a weapon that could still be fired effectively, even if the primary target was obscured by political fog. The flight into the zone was a moment of profound transition. As Rambo prepared his meager parachute gear, the silence from the command structure was deafening, a tacit admission that they were sending him in to die, or at least to succeed without official recognition. The jump itself was Rambo shedding the flimsy skin of the logger, the air rushing past him as a welcome embrace, preparing him for the humid, choking embrace of the jungle. The enemy presence, under Podolsky's command, wasn't just a border patrol. They were the embodiment of the lingering rot of the war, men who had profited from keeping the final secrets buried. Rambo's immediate, brutal efficiency contrasted sharply with the slow, grinding bureaucracy he'd left behind. He moved with an almost spiritual connection to the terrain, every snapping twig a potential communication, every shadow a hiding place. Kobau was the brief, vibrant flicker of genuine human connection. She wasn't a soldier. She was a survivor who had learned the necessary ruthlessness to navigate the aftermath of global conflict. Rambo saw in her a shared understanding of loss, the loss of innocence, the loss of country, the loss of viable futures. When the ambush hit, and she made the ultimate sacrifice, shielding him from a fatal blow, it wasn't just an ally falling. It was the extinguishing of the last spark of tenderness Rambo allowed himself. Her death weaponized him beyond any official mandate. The vengeance he sought was no longer about the POWs. It was about paying the debt of blood spilled in his name. The sequence where he begins to systematically dismantle the enemy operations is a masterclass in applied trauma. He doesn't just kill, he unravels their security, turning their own carefully constructed barriers against them. Each explosion, each precisely thrown knife, was an exhalation of the years of unaddressed PTSD. He was finally using the monstrous skills he'd been taught, and for the first time in years, he felt purposeful, if terrifyingly lethal. Troutman's intervention was the ultimate act of a commander who realized his tools had been corrupted. Watching his protege become a one-man army, utterly betrayed by the system he was trying to serve, forced Troutman to break protocol entirely. Hijacking the bird was not about following orders. It was about rescuing the man, not the mission, admitting that Rambo's war was just and true, regardless of Washington's stamp of approval. The final stand is Rambo embracing the chaos. He absorbs the firepower, the relentless assault, and transforms it into kinetic energy. He becomes the myth, the unstoppable force that the jungle itself seemed to conspire to protect. When the smoke cleared and he stood over the wreckage, the surviving Americans looked at him with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. He was their savior, yes, but he was also a terrifying manifestation of the war that never truly ended for some. Troutman stepping forward, not with handcuffs or a reprimand, but with quiet respect, confirmed the grim reality. Rambo was too potent, too irrevocably changed, to ever fit back into the neat, dishonest narrative of peacetime America. The silent understanding between them was heavy, a shared knowledge that the jungle had finally called its favorite son home, and he would always answer. The return to American soil, even under the guise of a successful operation, felt like being dropped onto an alien planet. The helicopter lifted Rambo, the surviving POWs, and the perpetually weary Troutman away from the ravaged landscape. But the transition was jarring. The world of clean lines, paved roads, and orderly bureaucracy seemed utterly absurd to Rambo, whose senses were still tuned to the immediate threat of a hidden tripwire or the scent of gunpowder. He carried the ghosts of Kobau and the unspoken horrors of the camps within him, heavier than any equipment. As they landed, the scene was not one of heroic reception, but of sterile military protocol, a forced choreography designed to manage the narrative. Military officials, those distant figures who had signed his deployment orders without understanding the cost, hovered nearby, their faces a mixture of relief at the successful extraction and palpable anxiety over Rambo's unmanageable state. He was a loose end, a living testament to their negligence and potential war crimes. Troutman, ever the astute observer of command structures, stepped in immediately, creating a buffer between Rambo and the eager paperwork pushers. He knew that for Rambo, processing the reality of survival meant confronting the lies of the mission. The physical wounds would heal, but the moral wounds inflicted by the mission's near-total abandonment were deep and festering. Troutman's mission now shifted from extraction to damage control, protecting the only man he ever truly respected in uniform from the system that sought to neutralize him once his usefulness expired. Rambo barely registered the surroundings. His focus was internal, cataloging the faces of the men he saved, the faces of the men he couldn't save, and the terrifying clarity of the violence he had unleashed. The quiet dignity of the rescued soldiers, their silent gratitude a painful balm, was the only reward that held any meaning. They had seen the monster Rambo had become in the jungle, and they accepted it as a necessary evil, a price paid in full. When the moment came for Rambo to step off the transport, officially debriefed and momentarily discharged, there was a profound lack of enthusiasm in his movement. He looked at Troutman, the unspoken question hanging heavy between them. Where does a man who has only survived by becoming the apex predator go when the hunting season is declared closed? Troutman offered no easy answers, merely a solemn nod. He understood that Rambo wasn't just coming home. He was returning as a foreign entity, armed with memories that the sanitized streets of America could never accommodate. The film ends with the lingering image of Rambo walking away from the official reception, not towards a waiting car or a cheering crowd, but towards the periphery, the edge of the frame, melting back into the shadows from whence he was temporarily summoned. He had fulfilled the mission on his own terms, achieving a brutal, personal form of justice. But in doing so, he had forfeited any chance at the simple peace he briefly held while sawing logs. He was forever branded by the fire of that second tour, a living monument to the forgotten soldiers and the lies used to cover their sacrifice. His final destination remains ambiguous, but his path is clear. Perpetual vigilance on the fringes, the eternal warrior waiting for the next inevitable call or the next unavoidable confrontation with the world that created him. The sterile environment of the homecoming facility felt like a suffocating cage compared to the chaotic freedom of the jungle. The polished floors reflected the harsh fluorescent lights, illuminating the unnatural stillness of the officers waiting to process the returned heroes. These men, clad in crisp uniforms that had never been stained by mud or blood, represented the very bureaucracy that had so readily sacrificed Rambo upon insertion. Their practiced smiles and clipped congratulations sounded hollow, an auditory offense to a man whose ears were still attuned to the subtle shift in wind that signaled an incoming mortar round. Troutman positioned himself as an immovable object between Rambo and the tide of administrative procedure. He was the last true shield, a man who had climbed high enough in the ranks to see the gears turning, and who now used that knowledge to protect the integrity of his soldier. He spoke in low, firm tones to the military brass, ensuring that Rambo was given space, that the immediate psychological evaluations were superficial, a mere box-ticking exercise for the press. Troutman knew that rushing Rambo into the light would only provoke an immediate, unpredictable reaction, perhaps a violent assertion of self against the perceived capture. Rambo's gaze swept over the scene, lingering on the faces of the rescued POWs. They were physically present, breathing American air, yet their eyes held a haunted quality, the look of men who had seen their humanity stripped away, piece by piece. Their quiet acknowledgement of Rambo, a shared, painful understanding of what it took to survive against impossible odds, was the only currency Rambo accepted. They saw not a hero, but a necessary monster, and that recognition was strangely stabilizing. When Rambo finally disembarked from the transport, his movements were deliberately slow, almost ritualistic. Each step was an intentional rejection of the environment, a physical manifestation of his internal dissonance. He was stripped of his weapons, his familiar bow and knives replaced by the humiliating vulnerability of civilian clothes, yet the lethal energy remained coiled beneath the surface. He carried the scent of the jungle, the memory of Kobau's final touch, and the metallic tang of Podovsky's blood, odors that no amount of disinfectant could erase. He met Troutman's eyes one last time, before turning away from the formal proceedings. There was no need for dialogue. The colonel understood that Rambo wasn't merely processing a return. He was assessing an ongoing threat assessment. The world was still dangerous, still full of unseen enemies who preferred the comfort of lies over the brutality of truth. Rambo walked towards the edge of the controlled area, not running, but moving with an inexorable purpose that suggested he was simply following the trajectory of his own internal gravity. He faded from the sight of the official personnel, a phantom dissolving into the anonymity of the wider world. He hadn't chosen to become a legend, nor had he chosen to be abandoned, but in surviving the impossible on his own terms, he had cemented his status as an outsider. He was no longer a soldier seeking integration. He was a force of nature exiled to the fringes, forever listening for the next necessary battle that only he was equipped or cursed to fight. The silence that followed his departure was not peace, but the tense quiet before the next storm. The sun beat down on the anonymous landscape Rambo finally chose for his vanishing act. A place sufficiently desolate that the military's long, grasping fingers would struggle to find purchase. He shed the ill-fitting civilian attire like a snakeskin, the act itself a minor ritual of purification. The freedom he achieved was purely geographical. Spiritually, he remained chained to the humid darkness of the Vietnamese interior. The noise of the modern world, the distant hum of traffic, the mechanical drone of aircraft overhead, registered as irritating static against the silence he craved. A silence only truly achieved in the moments immediately preceding violent action. He found temporary refuge in the deep woods, a facsimile of the environment that understood him best. Here, he could rebuild his arsenal, not with government-issued gear, but with the raw materials of nature and his own meticulously salvaged combat supplies. His hands, which had momentarily pretended to be those of a logger, returned to their true vocation, shaping wood into deadly projectiles, fashioning snares, and ensuring that every breath he took was covered by a strategic vantage point. This solitary reconstitution was vital. It was his way of proving to himself that the system hadn't broken him entirely, that the skills were still sharp, even if the target remained undefined. Meanwhile, Troutman was waging a different kind of battle back in the sterile halls of power. He was battling the narrative, the carefully constructed fable of a clean, successful operation, where the rogue element, Rambo, was safely tucked away. Troutman's promotion prospects, his career itself, became secondary to the need to monitor the situation. He understood that Rambo was not prone to settling down. He was a creature calibrated for high-stress existence, and putting him back in a quiet town would be like introducing high explosives to a matchbox. Troutman saw the government's desire to erase the mess, but he knew that wiping Rambo from the record was impossible. Rambo was the living, breathing evidence of their moral bankruptcy. The few rescued POWs who managed to offer public statements spoke with a guarded reverence for Rambo, carefully omitting the most brutal details of the slaughter, details that would invite too much scrutiny on the covert nature of the mission. They were attempting to integrate, adopting the required veneer of normalcy, but their shared glances often sought the empty space where Rambo should have been standing. They were saved, but their savior remained lost. For Rambo, the days blurred into a cycle of rigorous survival training. He wasn't waiting for orders. He was waiting for the next threat, whether it came from old enemies resurfacing or new ones attempting to silence the inconvenient truth he represented. The vengeance for Kobau was a banked fire, ready to roar back to life should any shadow from the past dare to approach his isolated sanctuary. He had proven he could fight the war on his terms against the enemy and the command structure simultaneously. That knowledge was both his curse and his only remaining source of power. He was a ghost made flesh, forever haunting the borders of the reality he could no longer inhabit. The isolation Rambo cultivated wasn't merely a preference. It was a necessary prophylactic against the perceived contamination of civilization. The woods became his sanctuary and his barracks simultaneously. He moved through the dense undergrowth not as an intruder, but as a part of the ecosystem, an organism perfectly adapted to perpetual low-level hostility. The self-sufficiency was absolute. Every trap laid, every piece of scavenged material repurposed, was a quiet reaffirmation of his own competence, a direct refutation of the military handlers who had deemed him disposable equipment. He would sometimes pause at the edge of a clearing, the sunlight harsh on his face, staring into the middle distance, seeing not the trees, but the faces of the men he left behind in the camps. The men who wouldn't make it to the extraction point. These spectral visions fueled a grim resolve. The war hadn't ended in Vietnam. It had merely moved residents into his skull. The silence he maintained wasn't peace. It was the careful conservation of energy for the next necessary explosion. Back in the world of concrete and classified documents, Troutman wrestled with the ethical fallout. He found himself increasingly marginalized, a relic whose loyalty to Rambo superseded his adherence to the institutional chain of command. He recognized the dangerous precedent set. Rambo had exposed the rot at the core of military secrecy, and the establishment's primary goal now was containment through silence. Troutman's calls became fewer, more coded, attempts to establish a lifeline without leaving a traceable electronic signature. He knew Rambo wouldn't seek contact unless the threat became existential, meaning the government itself decided to clean up its final loose end. The psychological profiles being generated on Rambo described him as an irredeemable anomaly, a weapon that had achieved self-awareness. This assessment was accurate in its assessment of his lethality, but it missed the core of his motivation, a deeply ingrained, if twisted, sense of loyalty that had been profoundly betrayed. He was fighting not against an ideology, but against abandonment. As weeks bled into months, Rambo's physical presence seemed to meld further with the wilderness. He was leaner, harder, his eyes constantly assessing threats that weren't there, or perhaps threats that were just too well hidden for anyone else to see. He had stared into the abyss of betrayal and stared back with equal, if colder, intensity. His refusal to settle, his continued existence on the periphery, was his ultimate ongoing act of defiance. He was a living reminder that some debts, particularly those incurred in blood and silence, are never truly paid off through paperwork or ceremony. They are paid by the man who survives holding the ledger. He remained ready, an untamed storm waiting for the next geographical shift that might force him back into the light or deeper into the necessary dark. The transformation Rambo underwent in his self-imposed exile was a chilling testament to the depth of his psychological scarring. He wasn't merely hiding, he was evolving into a purer form of his combat self, stripped of the last vestiges of societal pretense. The minimal needs of his existence, fire, water, and constant vigilance, served as a brutal, purifying ritual. He no longer dreamed of peace. He dreamed in tactical maps, visualizing flanking maneuvers against unseen threats that likely existed only in the echo chamber of his trauma. The occasional, carefully disguised communication from Troutman served as a vital, if painful, link to the outside world. These messages were less about reassurance and more about alerts, vague warnings whispered across secure lines that the wolves were sniffing around the edges of his sanctuary. Troutman was playing a dangerous game, protecting Rambo by keeping one step ahead of the intelligence agencies who were undoubtedly attempting to track the highly valuable, highly dangerous asset they had failed to control. The colonel understood that Rambo was a reflection of the nation's failures, and exposing him would mean exposing their own deep cowardice during the war. For Rambo, the memory of Ko Bao served as the sharpest edge of his remaining humanity. Her loss was a constant, low-grade ache that occasionally flared into blinding rage. He kept a small, crude marker for her in his secluded area. Not a cross, but a simple arrangement of stones, a silent acknowledgement of the only person who saw him without demanding he be someone else. This private memorial kept the rage focused, preventing it from dissolving into generalized madness. He was fighting for the integrity of the sacrifices made, even those he felt responsible for. He watched the news reports, fragmented and distorted through his isolated lens, seeing the official narrative praising the successful extraction and conveniently omitting the firefight, the betrayal, and the systematic slaughter of the enemy that had actually secured the result. This calculated dishonesty only cemented Rambo's alienation. He realized that the war he fought in Vietnam was no different from the war he was fighting now, a battle against carefully crafted illusions. The final implication of his continued existence was that the conflict was never truly over for him. He was the living embodiment of the unfinished business of Southeast Asia. He had achieved a victory so absolute, so devastating to his enemies, that his continued presence represented a threat to the carefully constructed peace of Washington. He was free only so long as he remained untamed, a loose cannon whose trajectory could not be predicted by any military projection. Rambo settled deeper into the woods, not in defeat, but in strategic retreat, the ultimate soldier waiting patiently for the world to once again prove itself unworthy of his silence. The silence Rambo cultivated was not the absence of sound, but the presence of absolute control over his environment. Every rustle of leaves, every distant cry of a bird was catalogued, analyzed, and dismissed or flagged as a potential indicator of intrusion. His routine was monastic in its severity. Physical training designed to keep his body perpetually at peak readiness, tracking drills that blurred the line between man and predator, and long stretches of simply observing the encroaching world from the safety of the deep shadows. He was a machine running on pure memory and residual duty, calibrated for a purpose that no longer officially existed. Troutman's sporadic contact was a necessary evil. When the colonel's coded messages arrived, they were often tinged with a weary frustration, the frustration of a good man trapped in a system designed to promote mediocrity and reward dishonesty. Troutman warned of increased governmental interest, hushed inquiries into the unofficial aspects of the rescue, suggesting that the cleanup operation might soon turn inward. He knew the brass saw Rambo not as a hero, but as a liability whose very survival threatened the fragile political stability built upon the foundation of convenient historical erasure. Trotman's advice was always the same: stay invisible, stay lethal, and trust no quarter. The absence of Kobau was a constant dull throbbing beneath the surface of Rambo's discipline. He never spoke of her, yet her memory informed his every defensive posture. She represented the brief, impossible possibility of a shared existence outside the war zone, a possibility violently denied by the machinations of the conflict. Her death wasn't just a loss of a comrade. It was the final severing of Rambo's tether to the hope of a normal future. He treated his emotional landscape as hostile territory, guarding against any sentiment that might slow his reaction time or cloud his judgment. He sometimes allowed himself to reflect on the nature of his victory. He had brought out the living proof of the government's abandonment, yes, but at the cost of his own sanity and any chance of reintegration. The men he saved were already slipping back into American life, their trauma manageable within the context of civilian support structures. Rambo, however, carried the weight of the slaughter required to achieve that extraction, the necessary depravity. He was the true survivor, the one marked indelibly by the ugliness required to achieve the good. The solitude allowed Rambo to confront the monstrous nature of his own efficiency. He recognized the terrifying ease with which he had orchestrated death. This wasn't the conflicted soldier of the first engagement. This was a force utterly adapted to lethal problem-solving. His continued hiding was less about evading capture and more about protecting the world from the sheer destructive potential he now embodied. He was a caged tiger, and the bars of the cage were woven from the jungle foliage he occupied, waiting for the moment when the perceived safety of the outside world would prove to be the true trap. He remained the sentinel of a forgotten war, perpetually poised on the razor's edge of necessary violence. The stillness of Rambo's self-imposed exile was deceptive, masking an internal clock ticking relentlessly toward the next unavoidable collision. His mastery over the wild was complete. He moved through the dense foliage, not just unseen, but unheard, a phantom existing just outside the measurable parameters of the civilized world. He ate what he killed or gathered, his existence pared down to the essential mechanics of survival, a stark, brutal efficiency that rejected the soft excesses of the life he briefly attempted to reclaim. Troutman, feeling the pressure mounting from his superiors, men whose careers were built on plausible deniability, knew his time for subtle warnings was ending. The tracking efforts against Rambo were increasing, utilizing sophisticated means to penetrate the very wilderness Rambo called his domain. The colonel began making riskier moves, dropping hints through old, untraceable dead drops, locations known only to those who had served deep in the shadows during the height of the Cold War paranoia. These weren't just alerts, they were tactical updates, ensuring that if the brass decided to send in a cleanup crew, Rambo would know precisely how many bullets they were packing and where their weak points lay. The ghosts of Vietnam had become Rambo's only constant companions. He often sat near his small stone marker for Kobau, not mourning in the traditional sense, but mentally rehearsing the firefights, looking for the tactical error that cost her life. This endless internal reenactment was his penance, ensuring that the price paid for his survival would not be forgotten in the bureaucratic fog of Washington. He understood that his refusal to assimilate was not just personal stubbornness. It was a necessary protest against a society that demanded heroes, but refused to acknowledge the ugly nature of their victories. He observed the distant lights of civilization with the detached curiosity of an anthropologist studying a strange, primitive tribe. Their concerns, taxes, traffic, petty political squabbles, seemed ludicrously small compared to the raw calculus of life and death he now lived by. He was fluent in a language of immediate consequence, a dialect the modern world had deliberately chosen to forget. The ultimate irony was that Rambo, the ultimate tool of government projection, was now the government's greatest threat simply by remaining alive and unmanaged. He represented the true, unedited cost of war, a ledger that political leaders preferred to keep buried. He had secured the freedom of his brothers and the memory of his lost love, but the cost was his own permanent alienation. As the seasons shifted, Rambo remained rooted in the shadows, a living monument to the betrayal of the fighting man, forever ready to defend the perimeter of a war that, for him, was still actively raging. The transition from the humid chaos of the extraction zone to the cold, impersonal silence of the American woods only deepened Rambo's sense of displacement. He moved like a phantom limb, an extension of the jungle that refused to be reattached to the body of society. His discipline, honed to a razor's edge by years of conflict and recently sharpened by the need to eliminate Colonel Podolsky's men, became his only companion. He treated every sunrise as a temporary reprieve, not a promise of a new day. Troutman, ever the weary conscience of the military machine, found his position increasingly untenable. The brass, spooked by the sheer scale of the cover-up required to bury the truth of the POW camps, began applying pressure not just on Rambo's file, but on Troutman himself. They wanted a neat bow placed on the affair, a final report declaring Rambo either deceased in action or safely institutionalized. Troutman resisted, his loyalty to Rambo now a profound professional and moral failing in the eyes of his superiors. He saw the shadows lengthening, recognizing that the bureaucratic cleanup could quickly turn into a physical hunt for the only person who knew the whole story. John Rambo. Rambo's existence was a study in controlled minimalism. He needed little, but what he needed, silence, space, and the tools to defend that space, was fiercely guarded. The memory of Kobau remained crystallized, not softening with time, but hardening into an immovable point of reference. She was the symbol of the life that was possible outside the soldier's mandate, and her death cemented the finality of his chosen path. If he were ever to engage again, it would be without the naive hope of a return to logging camps. It would be an assertion of existence in the face of those who demanded his erasure. He often performed drills near a river, using the current to wash away his tracks, a subconscious effort to erase the residue of his past life. He was a man who had accomplished the impossible, freeing men the government swore were already dead. Yet this massive victory yielded no applause, only suspicion. The irony was a bitter flavor on his tongue. His greatest act of service had made him the nation's most wanted fugitive, not by foreign enemies, but by his own shadow government. The woods, for Rambo, offered a form of savage integrity. Here, death was honest, a necessary consequence of failure, not a political maneuver. He was thriving in the environment that society deemed savage, precisely because it mirrored the savage reality he now carried inside. He watched the world from a distance, a sentry permanently posted on the border between the two realities, prepared to meet any probe with the full, terrible force of the man forged in the jungles of Southeast Asia. A soldier who had finally realized that the only reliable command structure was his own. The encroaching winter, a season Rambo usually welcomed for its clarity and harsh, unforgiving structure, felt different this time. It was not a familiar challenge. It was a tightening net. The snow, which should have offered excellent tracking opportunities for his own surveillance, was instead being used by others. He detected the subtle disturbances, a snap of a branch too uniform, the almost imperceptible depression in the snowpack that betrayed a military-grade boot rather than an animal's paw. The search had intensified, growing less covert and more desperate as the political heat on the loose ends of the POW mission mounted. Troutman, now operating on borrowed time and thin lines of communication, risked his final, most direct intervention. He didn't appear in person, knowing that direct contact would immediately trigger high-level alarms. Instead, he utilized an old asset, a grizzled, retired journalist known for his appetite for suppressed truth and his absolute disdain for the Pentagon brass. The message wasn't a call for retreat, it was a specific intelligence drop. The government was preparing a plausible scenario to neutralize Rambo. A staged encounter gone wrong, a final, unavoidable suicide. The target was no longer just containment. It was permanent silence. Rambo received the coded warning through a makeshift radio receiver he had painstakingly assembled from scavenged electronics. The static hiss of the broadcast was overlaid with Trotman's grim, almost defeated tone. It was the sound of the colonel admitting he had lost control of the narrative, and perhaps lost the war against the system. Rambo didn't feel fear. He felt a cold, crystalline clarity. The deception confirmed everything he suspected. His service was transactional, and his life held value only until the truth he represented became too inconvenient. He burned the cabin. It was a symbolic act, destroying the temporary structure that symbolized his attempt at domesticity. There was no looking back, no retreat to the periphery of civilization. If they wanted him silent, they would have to silence the jungle first. He stripped his meager possessions down to the absolute essentials. His custom bow, a few knives, and the ingrained memory of every combat scenario ever taught to him. The emotional residue of Kobau was now less grief and more an internal furnace, fueling his readiness to face down any incoming force. His preparation was methodical, almost artistic in its lethality. He booby-trapped the perimeter of his small sanctuary with improvised devices that utilized the natural features of the terrain. Tripwires woven from nearly invisible fishing line, pressure plates concealed under fresh snow, aiming not to kill indiscriminately, but to inflict maximum disruption and psychological terror on disciplined military teams. He wasn't planning on running anymore. He was preparing to meet the invasion on his terms, turning the vast, indifferent wilderness into his personal fortress, waiting for the inevitable confrontation where the hunter and the hunted would finally occupy the same bloody ground. The final battle, he knew, would not be for a country or for any government's approval, but for the right to exist outside their dictated reality. The immediate impact of Rambo First Blood Part 2 upon its 1985 release was visceral, cementing John Rambo not merely as a tragic Vietnam veteran, but as an archetype of Reagan-era retribution. Where the original First Blood carefully dissected the trauma inflicted upon a soldier abandoned by his country, the sequel transforms that trauma into raw, unapologetic action, serving as both a cathartic fantasy for a nation still wrestling with the ghosts of Southeast Asia and a significant pivot in Sylvester Stallone's career trajectory. Stallone, having already established himself as a powerhouse with Rocky, skillfully navigated the transition from underdog to idealized warrior. His investment in the Rambo character went beyond simple acting. He co-wrote the screenplay, indicating a strong desire to steer the narrative toward the popular, more aggressive vision the public demanded. This iteration of Rambo is less the reactive victim and more the proactive instrument of historical rectification. He is sent back to the jungles, ostensibly to ascertain the fate of American POWs still held captive, a deeply sensitive and politically charged subject at the time. The thematic core of the film revolves around the concept of unfinished business and national betrayal. Colonel Sam Troutman, expertly played by Richard Crenna, acts as Rambo's moral compass and handler, a necessary tether to the military structure Rambo simultaneously obeys and despises. Crenna's career, marked by distinguished supporting roles, here provides the gravitas needed to ground Stallone's increasingly mythic physicality. Troutman understands the psychological cost of war in a way the Washington bureaucrats clearly do not. Rambo's immersion back into the Vietnamese landscape is a masterclass in establishing environmental superiority. Shedding his civilian clothes for the iconic sleeveless shirt and bandoliers, Stallone embodies a nearly supernatural capability for survival and combat. The film leans heavily into spectacle, with extended sequences showcasing Rambo's ingenuity. The massive bow and arrow, for instance, becomes an instant icon, a primitive yet hyper-efficient weapon contrasting sharply with the advanced technology of his pursuers. This visual language suggests that true heroism is elemental, untainted by bureaucracy. The pivotal narrative shift occurs when Rambo, instead of merely completing his intelligence mission, chooses to actively rescue the prisoners, defying direct orders. This insubordination is framed not as rebellion, but as righteous indignation. He becomes the one-man army capable of achieving what the entire US military apparatus failed to do during the actual conflict, bringing the boys home. This narrative move resonated deeply with audiences seeking closure and a sense of American dominance restored, even if only on the silver screen. The introduction of Co Bao, the Vietnamese mercenary played by Julia Nixon, adds a necessary layer of human connection amidst the relentless action. Her character serves as Rambo's temporary anchor to humanity in the hostile environment, offering a brief respite before the inevitable tragedy that befalls most romantic interests in action franchises. Her death further fuels Rambo's rage, transforming his mission from retrieval to outright vengeance against the Vietnamese military presence, particularly the brutal Captain T.V. Min. Critically, the film's portrayal of the enemy is starkly one-dimensional, serving primarily as obstacles for Rambo's escalating prowess. The action sequences, choreographed by industry veterans, are relentless. The helicopter finale, in particular, showcases the era's embrace of explosive practical effects. Rambo. First Blood Part 2 is less concerned with subtlety than its predecessor. It is an exercise in aggressive catharsis. It redefined Stallone as the definitive action hero of the mid-80s, moving him away from the gritty realism of Rocky toward a more operatic, mythological status. The film is a powerful artifact of its time, reflecting a national desire to rewrite a painful chapter of history through the fantasy of overwhelming, justified force. Troutman's final line, noting that Rambo is an instrument of war now unsuited for peace, perfectly encapsulates the paradox of the victorious but internally scarred hero the film had created. The sequel operates on a foundation of heightened stakes, pushing John Rambo further into the realm of myth, a space where the laws of physics and standard military procedure are mere suggestions easily overridden by sheer willpower. Stallone's physical transformation for the role is central to this mythology. He didn't just get leaner, he sculpted a body that appeared almost painfully hardened, every sinew telegraphing the suppressed violence simmering beneath the surface. This physical manifestation mirrors the film's central thesis, that the solution to complex geopolitical wounds lies in brute, uncomplicated force. Rambo's return to the jungle is framed not as a deployment, but as a homecoming to the only environment where he feels truly competent. The initial sequence where he is dumped into the Vietnamese jungle, stripped of modern conveniences, highlights his alienation from the civilized world that betrayed him. The technology of the present day, the tracking devices, the bureaucracy, is shown to be useless against the ingrained instincts of a career soldier pushed beyond his breaking point. The dynamic between Rambo and Troutman sharpens significantly here. Troutman is the last voice of command that Rambo respects, yet even that respect erodes when the mission parameters shift from surveillance to action. Crenna plays Troutman with a weary resignation. He is the gatekeeper who knows the beast he is unleashing. He understands that sending Rambo back is a gamble, sacrificing one soldier's sanity for the political appeasement of the American public desperate for answers regarding the POWs. Troutman represents the lingering guilt of the establishment, the men who sent the boys to war, and now need someone expendable to clean up the resulting moral debris. The action sequences themselves are less about strategy and more about overwhelming sensory input. The famous bow and arrow sequences are pivotal because they strip Rambo down to his essential skills. He uses the jungle against itself. When he finally confronts his captors, the violence is not hesitant. It is the overflow of years of suppressed trauma finding an immediate, explosive outlet. Each enemy dispatched is a symbolic strike against the political apparatus that deemed him a failure in the first place. The narrative's embrace of Rambo as the ultimate American revenge fantasy is unmistakable. He is not just rescuing soldiers, he is avenging the entire national ego bruised by the outcome of the war. The film grants him the ultimate victory denied to the actual American forces, absolute domination over the enemy territory and the successful extraction of the lost. This fictionalized triumph served as a powerful balm during a decade still deeply divided over Vietnam. When Rambo ultimately forces the government official, Murdoch, to face the rescued POWs, it is the climax of Rambo's moral mission. He forces the bureaucrats who ordered him to simply observe the truth to witness the horrifying reality they tried to sanitize. The look on Murdoch's face as he realizes the depth of his own cowardice, contrasted with Rambo's resolute, barely contained fury, is the film's strongest indictment of political hypocrisy. Rambo, the man deemed unstable and incapable of civilian life, is the only one morally equipped to carry out the mission's true ethical obligation. The film's power, therefore, lies not just in its spectacle, but in its successful inversion of perceived weakness into absolute, necessary strength. The emotional resonance of the film is derived almost entirely from Rambo's isolation. He operates in a vacuum, surrounded by adversaries or by allies who are either disposable, like Kobau, or fundamentally powerless against the higher echelons of command, like Trotman. This profound solitude underscores the film's critique of the military-industrial complex, which views soldiers as highly specialized yet ultimately replaceable tools. Rambo is fundamentally alienated from both the war zone he is sent to revisit and the comfortable American society he is meant to return to. His inability to integrate post-conflict is the tragedy that propels the violence. The jungle is the only place where his hypervigilance and lethal skills are validated, not pathologies to be medicated away. Stallone's performance, particularly in moments of quiet intensity, hints at the deep fissures in the character. Even when preparing his traps or cleaning his weapons, there is a heavy, brooding quality that suggests constant internal calculus. A soldier always anticipating the next attack. His communication is sparse, relying on guttural expressions and intense eye contact, a deliberate choice that emphasizes the breakdown of conventional language in the face of extreme experience. The audience is positioned to understand that the enemy is not just the North Vietnamese army, but the very concept of authority that dictates when and how a soldier is allowed to process their trauma. The visual contrast between the jungle and the brief excursions into civilization further heightens this tension. The brief moments where Rambo is supplied or given directives are claustrophobic and sterile, emphasizing the artificiality of the political maneuvers. Once he is back beneath the canopy, freed from the gaze of his handlers, his movements become fluid, almost primal. The film celebrates this return to a savage state, positioning Rambo as a modern-day warrior returning to his natural habitat, albeit a horrifying one. The sheer scale of destruction he unleashes, the explosions, the relentless machine gun fire, is a visual manifestation of his internal scream against the institutional failure that created him. The theme of redemption through action is paramount. For Rambo, saving the POWs is not just about patriotic duty. It is about achieving a level of success and closure that was denied in the actual war. Every successful ambush, every near-death escape, is a form of retroactive victory over the circumstances that defined his failure to cope back home in the first blood. When he finally stands victorious, surrounded by the liberated men, it is a momentary crystallization of purpose, a single instance where his existence made perfect, destructive sense. The film, in its aggressive patriotism, effectively argues that salvation for the forgotten soldier lies not in peace or therapy, but in a final, overwhelming act of martial heroism. This ending, however triumphant on the surface, leaves the viewer with the lingering unease that Rambo has only secured his identity as a weapon, forever locked into the cycle of conflict that defines him. The visual motif of the fire that permeates the latter half of the film serves as a crucial emotional and symbolic anchor. As Rambo systematically destroys the enemy infrastructure, the screen is bathed in the orange and black hues of uncontrolled combustion. This inferno is not merely collateral damage. It functions as a baptismal fire, burning away the vestiges of the restrained veteran from the first film. It is the externalization of his emotional state, a complete conflagration of protocol, patience, and restraint. The sheer scale of the pyrotechnics reflected the audience's hunger for decisive closure, an absolute severing from the ambiguity and lingering questions surrounding the war itself. Stallone's mastery of physical understatement is key to maximizing the impact of the explosive moments. A tense silence marked only by the heavy breathing or the click of a safety coming off a rifle precedes the eruption of violence. This contrast ensures that Rambo's subsequent actions carry maximum weight. When he hijacks the helicopter and wages war against the remaining encampment, it is the ultimate act of self-assertion. He is no longer taking orders. He is imposing his own moral code, rewritten in gunpowder and napalm, upon the landscape. This sequence is the zenith of the action genre's capability in the mid-80s, a spectacle engineered to overwhelm rational thought and deliver pure, distilled satisfaction. Furthermore, the characterization of the remaining American forces, particularly the treacherous CIA agent who orchestrated the cover-up, embodies the internal enemy. These antagonists are weak, physically unimposing, and motivated by political survival rather than conviction. Their cowardice, when exposed by Rambo's terrifying competence, solidifies the narrative's argument. The true patriots are those willing to break rules and risk everything, while the system protects its own incompetence. This moral inversion elevates Rambo from mere action hero to a figure of revolutionary justice against a corrupt establishment, echoing the anti-government sentiments occasionally bubbling beneath the surface of Reagan-era optimism. The lingering emotional residue, however, rests with Troutman. His confrontation with Rambo in the final moments, where he acknowledges Rambo's transformation, is perhaps the film's most emotionally complex scene. Troutman mourns the loss of the man he knew, recognizing that he has either saved a nation's honor or irrevocably destroyed a soldier's soul in the process. His final paternal warning about Rambo being a force too dangerous for peacetime speaks volumes about the nature of creating such an effective instrument of war. The film leaves the audience with the uneasy realization that the victory celebrated is temporary, a necessary explosion, but one that ensures the hero remains fundamentally broken and perpetually ready for the next jungle that calls him. The final, almost surreal sequence where Rambo stands amidst the liberated POWs, his face smeared with jungle grime and victory, marks the absolute peak of his symbolic transformation. He is no longer the haunted veteran of Hope, Arkansas. He is now a living monument to unfulfilled military objectives, a demigod forged in Southeast Asian fire. The sheer physical contrast between Rambo, utterly at home in this chaotic, destructive environment, and the emaciated, shell-shocked prisoners emphasizes the chasm between those who fought and those who merely managed the fight. He becomes their redeemer, their terrifying angel of deliverance, whose methods are brutal, but whose intent is pure salvation from their imposed purgatory. The emotional weight carried by Stallone in this climax is conveyed through minimal dialogue, relying instead on the sheer intensity of his gaze and the almost religious weight of his presence. He has achieved the impossible, yet this success only isolates him further. His relationship with the rescued men is transactional. He freed them, but he cannot join them in their return to normalcy. That normalcy is now a foreign country to him. This speaks to the central tragic irony of the entire Rambo mythos. The skills required for ultimate survival in war make peaceful integration utterly impossible. Troutman's decision to ultimately stand by Rambo, even when Rambo defies the direct chain of command to confront Murdoch, solidifies their bond as a tragic fraternity of warriors. Troutman sacrifices his last shreds of institutional standing to protect the soldier he understands better than anyone in Washington. When Trotman tells Murdoch that Rambo is the only one who could have pulled this off, it is a supreme indictment of the very structure Trotman himself represents. He is admitting that the system failed and that only the soldier deemed unfit for society, the broken one, could succeed where the organized machinery faltered. The film's lasting impact, structurally speaking, is its complete commitment to the power fantasy. It bypasses the introspection that made the first film resonate in favor of delivering a direct, visceral payoff. It taught audiences that sometimes overwhelming force is the only language the past understands. By having Rambo literally carry the rescued men out of the battlefield, first the helicopter, then metaphorically, the film provides the narrative closure Vietnam denied America. This catharsis, bought at the price of Rambo's own psychological stability, became the blueprint for countless action films that followed, establishing a new standard for muscular, emotionally driven spectacle where the hero is both victim and executioner. The lingering implication, powerfully underscored in the final frames, is that John Rambo is less a hero returned and more a force unleashed permanently beyond control. His final dramatic departure in the helicopter, soaring over the jungle canopy with Trotman watching from below, is not a scene of joyous homecoming, but one of necessary exile. He has completed his singular mission, yet in doing so, he has irrevocably burned his bridges to the world of laws and boundaries he was sent to momentarily serve. He has achieved a form of historical justice, but paid for it with permanent severance from society. Stallone masterfully frames this final isolation. When Rambo breaks down momentarily in the helicopter, perhaps the only moment of true, unadulterated vulnerability shown in the entire sequel, it's not from physical pain, but from the realization of his own utility. He sees himself clearly. He is the ultimate weapon, beautifully crafted for conflict, and now, without immediate conflict, he is adrift. The tears are not just for the horrors witnessed, but for the identity he cannot shed. This emotional beat prevents the film from being entirely empty spectacle. It roots the mayhem in the genuine agony of a man whose entire psychological framework is calibrated for lethal response. Richard Crenna's Trotman serves as the perfect foil and final lament. His career involved many roles requiring steadfast authority, but here, that authority is bent to acknowledge the superior, albeit tragic morality of insubordination. When he shakes Rambo's hand, there is a mutual understanding that they have both crossed a line from which there is no return. Trotman stays within the compromised system, tasked with managing the fallout and protecting Rambo's narrative, while Rambo is ejected into the shadows, destined to remain outside the gates. His final words are a promise of future installments, but also a profound statement on Rambo's condition. He is a creature of war, and peace will only ever be a temporary holding pattern. The aesthetic of the sequel, saturated with dense greens, humid air, and the constant threat of hidden adversaries, creates a heightened reality where survival is the only virtue. This world, built as a direct counterpoint to the sterile offices of the American government officials, validates Rambo's outsider status. His ingenuity, the use of mud to mask heat signatures, the silent dispatching of enemies, is celebrated as pure, uncorrupted soldiering, a direct homage to the guerrilla warfare narratives that romanticized the lone operative. The film succeeded because it offered a fantasy where morality was simplified to tribal terms. Those who help the captured versus those who betray them. Rambo chose the former, cementing his legacy as the impossible savior who achieved what an entire nation could not. A satisfying, if historically misleading, cinematic closure. The enduring legacy of Rambo, First Blood Part 2, lies precisely in its successful, almost total commitment to myth-making, even at the expense of the psychological nuance established in its predecessor. The film functions less as a continuation of a character study and more as the creation myth for the one-man army archetype that dominated action cinema throughout the late 1980s. Stallone, leveraging his established appeal as the underdog who becomes the ultimate fighter, crafts a figure of almost biblical retribution against perceived enemies, both external, the Vietnamese forces guarding the POWs, and internal, Murdoch and the cynical bureaucrats. The emotional texture of Rambo's journey is inextricably tied to his tools. The knife and the bow, primitive and deeply personal weapons, become extensions of his will, contrasting sharply with the impersonal, high-tech weaponry used by the enemy forces he systematically dismantles. When Rambo fires an arrow or plunges a blade, the audience experiences a direct, unmediated connection to the force of his rage. This kinetic energy is channeled